And we're live with another episode of The Focal Thought. And my guest today is Mehrdad Koohi. How are you doing, Mehrdad?
Good, good. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you for coming on the episode. This should be a fun episode. We've known each other since high school. We've gone
Mhm.
through, many different things together, different projects in terms of, music, learning things, in terms of education. We've been great friends. We've been worse friends. We've done life together. So I'm
That's right.
really excited to have you on board and share some of your experience, mainly in the category of linguistics. And
Mhm.
linguistics, in terms of language, it's something that's always fascinated me. Some of the writing that I've done, it stems from that. When you speak to people, it's all about linguistics. And the language is not just limited to what people speak in terms of the country, city, the tribe. It's also, you could look at music as a language. You could look at when you go into nature and you sort of feel that peace from nature. That's a language that nature has communicated to you. So I know it's not limited just to the language that we use to speak and write in our everyday life. My sense on language is the purpose is that it should convey a message, it should convey a feeling, an understanding. I know that that's personal to me. So if we can get into linguistics being the scientific study of language, that's my broad definition of that. If you can maybe elaborate on that.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, that's what linguistics is. If you came up with the most general phrase to describe it, scientific study of language. It is one of those disciplines, academic disciplines, that is less known or understood by generally speaking. So, for example, if I say, if someone asks another person, what are you studying in university? What do you want to study? And someone might say biology. People might nod and say, oh, okay. And they might not know much about biology, but it's kind of understood, or at least the person seems to know what biology is. But if you say linguistics, I have, my own personal experience, it's like, so you mean study languages? That's the most often heard one. So yeah, it's, I can give you kind of a slightly broader rundown of what exactly it is. So linguistics is not the same thing as just studying languages, as in, for example, I'm going to learn Portuguese and Chinese and, Italian, for example. Uh, so linguistics is it's a big umbrella term for a lot of different disciplines.
Sure.
But when you want to get into the more specific disciplines, you generally have to get a basic grounding in the different areas of linguistics. So it is a study of human languages. And if you break down human language into right down to the sounds, the individual sounds that each language has, you can start with phonetics and phonology. That will be the individual sounds in any specific language, and they're finite, and you can study the patterns, the way they're laid out in the words and sentences. And then you have morphology, which is the study of words and how words are formed in different languages. And then you step into the next level, where you have syntax, where that's at the sentence level, phrase and sentence level. So linguists kind of study what's happening at the phrase and sentence level in languages. Generally speaking, the syntax has a lot in common with the study of grammar. So there is a difference, but so when you hear grammar, usually you know how to put sentences together. And then beyond that, you get into discourse analysis. And discourse analysis is the study of how people communicate, and that's where we get into more where it comes to how you communicate certain ideas and things like that. Now, there's two main studies of discourse. One is more technical. You're studying how people, the patterns in conversations and spoken or written interactions. For example, turn taking. We don't really learn turn taking. Nobody sits us down and teaches us, but it's something that's innate in conversations, right? You kind of know when someone's done speaking, or someone's following along if they're saying mm-hmm, so that's one pattern in discourse. So that's a more technical thing. And then you've got discourse analysis that has to do with ideology and meaning. So how meaning is created, and then we get into ideology and things like that. For example, you can say you can refer to the same event, for example, using very different words, and each one of those ways would carry a certain ideology. We see that a lot in the media, how media might report or represent certain things. It's the same thing, same event, but depending on how you use language, you get different messages that are being sent out. So that's kind of like a broad overview of what linguistics is. There's also areas like once you pass the basic linguistics, you understand language in those levels. There are people who get into computational linguistics. So anything that you see where language is being processed on computers and devices, for example, Google Translate or speech recognition technology, usually invariably there's going to be linguists who are computational linguistics who are part of those projects. There's people who are involved in speech pathology. So people who graduate out of linguistics do go, some of them more into the speech pathology, so working with people with speech impediments or things like that. And there's also historical linguistics, where people try to kind of trace the origins of words and classify languages into different families and language groups. So there you go. It's an overview.
So when we say it's the scientific study of language, it really is getting into, it's almost as though you are going and learning that biology, because you're taking it into not only a fundamental level, but even before it's fundamental, into the cell stage. It's very different from someone going to university and studying, say, English literature, where they're studying it on a very broader level. They're studying authors. They're studying it sort of after, the language has happened. You're actually dissecting everything from, like you're saying, a paragraph to a sentence to a word, to the syllable of the word, to basically the history of the word as well, right?
Yep. Yeah, in fact, when I studying linguistics was sort of was a secondary period of study for me. I had studied music, like you mentioned in the intro. You and I actually went to music school together. Later on, I went to York University, Toronto's York University, to study English literature. I was very interested in writing and things like that. And switched to linguistics, precisely because of what you mentioned. I really liked this analysis of language. I just happened to take an elective course in linguistics, and it was an intro for me, and I really fell in love with that idea of breaking things down.
Nice. And then if we so with linguistics, we're analyzing the language and from different sort of contexts in terms of social, cultural, historical, maybe even political.
Oh yeah.
I've always said that the experience comes first, and then the language comes secondary to describe that experience. So,
right.
Say for example, you have this breathtaking view of a mountaintop with the sunset. Experiencing that, and then the language coming secondary to describe that. the choice of words you use, the tone that you use, the vocabulary you use in terms of the complexity of the word. It'll never do full justice to the experience, right? So that's one thing that's important to know, is that the language always comes after the experience. It's not the language makes the experience, even though it can in some.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in fact, nowadays, I that's kind of the area in which I do most of my thinking regarding language and experience. And yeah, I mean, if you think about it, what is language? Language is a means of expressing our thoughts and feelings and understanding other people's thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
And, there's a small area where, there's, like when you see a sign somewhere, even that's, it's communicating an idea. So there would be no thoughts, feelings, and ideas if we didn't have our lived experience. So that's right. And then the language is how we express those things if we want to. But the interesting area is how we can express things so differently from one another. And we talk about the same things, communicate the information and feelings about the same things in so many different ways. And that's a fascinating thing, where thought transitions into language is very interesting for me, and vice versa. So we have seen also, especially in Western societies, in the last couple of decades, there's a very strong focus on how language is used. So I'm sure you've noticed it as well, and listeners, where they're like, for example, how you talk about a certain social subject, social issue. We're actually focusing on the words themselves. And the argument is that language shapes society. Language shapes social practice and what we do. And that's true. It does. There's a researcher and linguist in that area who has written a lot about how language affects social practice. His name is, works out of England. His name is Norman Fairclough. And he talks about that a lot. And however, language is not by itself shaping all social practice and social thought. So there's that back and forth between how things become words and sentences from experience, and then how our experience of the world is shaped by the words and sentences that come in. So it's this two-way street or this cyclical process. So it's not, some people lean too much on language, and we've seen trying to police language, trying to say, say this word instead of that word because that's going to change the thinking behind it. It's true to some degree. However, it's not the only thing. It's not, if anything, it's about a 50-50 split.
Correct. And what you basically mean is, like, we have to be politically correct with our words and language in these modern days, right?
Right. I mean, there you go. Like, politically correct itself is an interesting phrase, right?
Yeah.
It's a phrase we use. Everybody kind of knows what they're talking about when they hear the phrase politically correct. But right away, different people can have different reactions to hearing that phrase itself, right? If I say, "Oh, enough with political correctness," someone might think this guy's a lot of people might think might place me in a more conservative category, right?
Yeah.
And then they might assume all kinds of other things about my political beliefs and ideology based on that one thing I said about political correctness.
And that becomes the focus rather than what the conversation was or the debate was.
Yeah. So just saying, words and sentences, that relationship between thoughts, feelings, and utterances, it's a lot more complex than most people give it credit for or think about. And I think that comes from my linguistics background, where you delve more deeply into how utterances are formed and how they're understood. It's a lot more complicated. Like we could, for tomorrow, we could adopt a particular person or group's way of speaking, but a few years later, we're not going to see the kinds of whatever social change, whether it's left or right or whatever, we're looking for.
And by being politically, say, correct with a word, or maybe not using a word because, society has deemed it, sort of like a word that is against certain principles or, any forward-moving evolution. Language has to evolve. We understand that, and there's different reasons why it might evolve. Some people might want to, speak less of its original form, right? So I think of people who come to English-speaking countries from, foreign countries that are not English-speaking.
Yep.
When they want to learn the English language, they don't necessarily have to go and learn Charles Dickens. I mean, it would be great on that level. Because that's sort of the purest or getting closer to the original form.
Okay, there's a flag there, so we'll talk about that. Yeah.
No, let's point out the flag there.
Yeah. Well, the flag is we have to. There's some taken for granted assumptions about language, which we have to watch out for. So this idea of purity, originality, things like that. So, for example, Dickensian English being a much purer form of English compared to, say, some other form of English that's being spoken now or whatever, or anything like that. For example, I remember having a conversation with a friend in university, and he had just taken a Latin course. And then he was like, oh, well, I'm studying the Latin of Cicero, because that was pure Latin. Cicero was a senator in Rome during the time of Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. So that's the pure Latin. And that's another example of it. The problem with that is. It's not based on the reality of how language evolved. So first thing people need to understand is, I think that one of the taken for granted assumptions is that language was somehow created by humans. So like, as in literally human beings got together and they created language. And then from that point,
humans maybe.
Sorry?
Would it be better to say it was evolved from humans?
I think it's factual to say it evolved. It's not just better; it's factual, because all the research that in historical linguistics and also in cognitive science related to language development in humans shows that we have an innate language capacity. So the idea that humans just got together and created a language is simply does not add up. So this language was something that Homo sapiens began to acquire, and it evolved with groups of Homo sapiens throughout the, say, 100 to 200,000 years that Homo sapiens have been around. Language has evolved slowly, and it's true that human beings created words, so they named things. They would name things, and they also, over time, especially when you look at so many things that are metaphorical expressions and things like that, like I'm going to spend time. Well, you're not really spending time. You're not taking something, time out of your pocket and handing it over to someone.
Yeah.
But so human beings do have created words and named things, but this capacity to have language and to form phrases and sentences is innate, and it's also tied to our memory, our ability to remember things, our ability to, perceive abstract things, abstract thinking and time and things like that. So the idea that human beings created language is false. So that's one thing. And then number two is some people might say, well, human beings have created languages. For example, Star Trek nerds, they might point to languages, synthetic languages that were created for the Klingons. So the Klingons, there's a Klingon dictionary. I don't know if there's a grammar book for it, or there was groups of linguists and philologists that created a synthetic language called Esperanto. And the idea was to create this language, and then the language would not have social connections, cultural connection to any particular race or culture. So it would be, a neutral in terms of ideology. That was the idea. They created this language called Esperanto with the full vocabulary and grammar and things. So it's true that human beings can make languages up. Yeah. Computer languages are another thing. However, if we're talking about regular human language, no, those are something that evolved over time. So just going back to flagging that idea, it's like if you're talking about Dickensian English being a more pure form. For example, I'm Iranian Canadian. A lot of Iranians, especially older Iranians, they talk about the Persian. This particular type of Persian is the pure type. It's or don't use Arabic words if you can use a Persian word instead. Stuff like that. For me, it's a question of ideology. As in, and it's tied to a lot of, it's tied to class structures and things that, pre-20th century type class structures and social stratification. If you think about it, until about 100 years ago, all around the world, including the West, maybe in the West, let's say 150 years ago to be safe, but not very long ago, most people were illiterate, right? 150 years ago in the world, 90% of the world was illiterate. The Western world began public education around, in the 19th century. So what I'm getting at is there was a very small amount of people who were literate, who, read books, who had books. Most people did not even, imagine having books. So there's a very small number of people who dictated what was pure language. The language that we read in our books, that's the pure language. The language that's being spoken out in the street is vulgar, plebeian language. So just to keep that in mind if we're talking about what the pure form of language is.
Sure. And I don't mean pure in the sense that, it's better, right? Because I actually think that language has been diluted. So if you go from, say, Shakespeare to Dickens to today, so if someone comes here and wants to learn the language, if they're learning Shakespeare, that's great. They're flexing their mental muscle. It's almost like doing a crossword on a higher level. But is it practical to, speak the language in today's, society? When you're interacting with friends, the language you speak with your friends versus the language you speak at work. I do see some dilution in that. It's like if you're learning math, there's a basic level of math, but then you can also learn a higher level of math. And not to say one is better, like you're saying in terms of purity, but, there is a scale to it, right? Because language is math at the end of the day.
Well, I agree in that the more you cultivate your ability to use language, the more sophisticated you can be in terms of expressing yourself and also to understand others. So sure, that's the idea. A good question would be, how do you cultivate your ability to use a language and your ability to understand a language, whether it's speaking or comprehending, reading comprehension, things like that. Sure, the more you improve your ability, the more sophisticated you can be in expressing yourself.
Sure. And we've seen that in growing up in Scarborough, which is a city, an urban city, at least with the sort of friends we hung around with in Toronto in Canada. And Scarborough had its own dialect almost, right?
That's right.
It came from people who were into sort of urban music and the slang that they used. You associated yourself with that identity. But if you went to work, you would not speak that dialect.
That's right. That's right. So you would call those, if you want to be a linguist nerd, you would call those registers, because dialects would be, a little, of course, yeah, if we're just speaking generally, then they're like a dialect. But there would be a register. You switch from your Scarborough hanging out with your buddies register to a more formal at work register. Yeah.
And the same difference between if you were to text someone, so the texting register, as you said, rather than converse with someone. You're not going to converse with someone as you might text, right? Like saying LOL, like, even though some might. I mean,
right. And then that's an interesting area too, because some people have pointed out that you're talking about texts. Or generally speaking, that texts culture. But then we've got more and more of a visual communication practices going on, right? So we can rely a lot more on visual cues online, in text, talking about emojis and things like that, and symbols and things. So some people are arguing that could affect the way we think, and it definitely does the way we think. So as a language relies more and more on kind of I would call them placeholder type words and phrases. For example, something, it was an awesome experience at a concert. One person might say, "Oh, that was lit." Yeah. Nothing's wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a great shorthand. Or, "Oh, the dude got owned." Like there was an argument, and one person somehow, in this person's the listener's perspective, lost the argument and saying the guy got owned. Or I don't know if you look at YouTube videos, you look at the thumbnail and the descriptions, we end up often very outlandish. Or they might say, so-and-so destroyed so-and-so in this debate, or so-and-so destroyed, snowflake student, something like that. And, it's kind of like mic drop type words. People understand them, but you're losing a lot of sophistication. You're the complexity of a particular situation or experience is lost. Most of it is lost when you're just using these sort of catchphrases that everybody understands right away.
Yeah. But
it's very superficial and on the surface. It's like you can't get deep when you just drop a little one word thing.
Got it. It's like when they say a picture has a 1,000 words. You viewing that picture, you're actually choosing those 1,000 words in your mind, rather than if the 1,000 words were written about that picture, right? It's someone else's interpretation giving you that experience, rather than you making your own experience.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's an area of interest for me as well, looking how, again, the relationship between language use and thinking, and how the degree to which language use is affecting thinking and will affect thinking, because it's really the aside from the arts, if painting and playing music and things like that, it's the only way we have to express ourselves, right? And it's also the only way we understand other people. So this reduction that I see, especially with newer generations, although older generations too, kind of the breadth of their ability to express themselves in language fossilizes at some point. I'm sure older folks, not everyone, but a lot of older folks, it's normal. It's very normal that you get to a certain age and you pretty much use the same words and you have the same thoughts.
Yeah.
Pretty much all the time. Like I've had conversations with older friends and people, family members, and sometimes I could tell the words that are coming out, and I know what's coming next. I know the same words that I've heard, and you can, and the thinking hasn't changed. And again, in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes it can lead to, I don't know, it can lead to a constrained way of thinking. So if you want to be innovative, if you want to have more new ideas, if you want to look at situations in more ways, to be able to break them down in different ways, to come up with solutions to problems, it really does pay to continue to always expand your ability to use language.
Sure. And then with something like that, so, as I've said, the experience comes first, and then you create the word to describe the experience. But then sometimes when you're doing writing, you might be looking for a different word. So you'll bring up, the thesaurus, and you'll see, say, for example, the word joy. You want a different word for it. So maybe happy, elation. You might know those from, your own head. But then if you, go to the internet and you see, okay, there's a word called bliss. You've never heard of that before.
Oh, yeah.
Definition. That gives you a whole another experience because you learned a new word. Do you find, because you do speak, different languages, do you find that learning new languages other than, say, your mother tongue will give you a different experience in life?
Absolutely. The degree to which will depends on the individual, but absolutely, learning a different language can be huge in many ways in terms of, again, making you a much more sophisticated thinker and user of language, whether it's your original language that you're already fluent in or other languages that you learn. That's the area of professional interest, because I am an educator and I work in language education, and I teach French in school. And one of the things I try to impart to the students is that idea, because a lot of them come in, especially with French, they really don't like it. They feel it's a chore, and they have a very legitimate question: why do we have to learn this? So one of the reasons I give them is it can literally build your brain. So on the cognitive level, on the neurological cognitive level, researchers have clearly shown that people who learn more languages have a lot more neural connections going on in terms of non-scientific evidence, anecdotal evidence. I see it everywhere. I see that people who have an interest in other languages or learn other languages end up being a lot more sophisticated thinkers. Again, that's a general pattern that I see. It goes on the neurological level. However, I think the other side is a dedicated language learner has to put into practice certain habits, certain thinking habits that can be very good for developing your cognitive abilities. I would say now there is a difference between people who acquire languages naturally, as in, for example, a child that lives in West Africa, might speak Bantu as their tribal language, but then there might be a language. There is a language between when they go from one village to another. There's a common language between the villages in the area, and then there are the official languages of the country which they learn. Sometimes it might be French and English on top of that. So you have people who simply, by growing up in a certain place, speak 4 or 5 languages fluently. Wow. So there's that. And then you've got people who might be passionate about language learning or simply forced to do it because of some professional reason or scholastic reason. And they have to actually try. They have to be, especially if they're older, they're past the language acquisition window, they have to actually, by effort and study, to learn a specific language. So there's 2 different ways of acquiring a language, and the language by study it brings in other skills that you have to develop in order to do it.
Got it. I like you're saying, the sophistication is one thing, the cognition is one thing, and then, the experience and the feeling is, other aspects. I remember when I was in Montreal in a retail store, I thanked someone, for something that they did. Mm-hmm. And in French, they said nothing. That's the English version of it. And I asked a friend, nothing. Like, what an unusual way to say that, because I wouldn't say it in English. And then I thought about it. I thought, that was really nice. Like, she was saying, think nothing of it, nothing. And that left a nice sort of, experience, right? Like a nice feeling from that word.
Yeah. In that sense, that makes me think of how people feel when you use their language. If you're in their country, or if you're with them, even in another country, and a little bit of their language. Now, it depends on the person and the country. But like, for example, I was in Turkey years ago. I taught at a private school in Turkey, and on one of our first days being introduced to the rest of the staff who were Turkish, we were stepping in as the English teaching crew, and everyone went on stage to greet the staff and say something about themselves, introduce themselves, and I went on stage when it was my turn to go on stage. I didn't speak Turkish, but I learned how to say, hello friends in Turkish. That's it, Merhaba arkadaşlar. I said, merhaba arkadaşlar, and the entire room erupted in a cheer. Yeah. I was so happy to hear someone speak their language. So it can have a real effect on people, just a little thing. At school, for example, I sometimes, if there are children who I know, or I see their last names, and then I kind of know at home, or I'm guessing at home they speak a specific language. I try to throw a phrase in that language, for example, in Spanish or in Portuguese or something, and you can see it makes them feel better if they're new to the school. It has that positive effect on people.
Got it. Yeah. And, there's many ways if you're meeting someone who's from a different country, a different culture, religion, language, etc., to break bread with them. And like you're saying, language is one of the most fundamental ways. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks so much for coming on this episode. It was great just to talk about something that, a lot of people take for granted. And we hope that, with the evolution or, de-evolution, depending on which way you look at it, that, we'll see what happens in the future. And hopefully, and maybe if we are, whittle down to using emoticons to communicate.
That's right.
As long as, you communicate the authenticity of the experience and the feeling, I think we'll be okay. So thanks again for the episode, and I wish
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.